The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are simply that, opinions. All are presumed innocent until proven otherwise in a court of law. Sensitive topics are discussed. Discretion is advised.
It was a brutal double homicide in a small New England town. In January of 2017, police found Christine Sullivan and Jenna Pellegrini dead under the porch of a home in Farmington, New Hampshire. Prosecutors paint their accused killer, Timothy Verrill, as a paranoid drug dealer, alleging that he was involved in a drug trafficking operation with Sullivan and the home's owner, her boyfriend, Dean Smoronk, and that he killed the two women believing that Pellegrini was a police informant. Defense attorneys maintain Verrill's innocence and point to Dean as the possible killer. I'm Vinny Politan, and on this week's Court TV podcast, we have both sides' opening statements in full as the Small Town Secrets murder trial gets underway.
This is the Court TV podcast with Vinny Politan.
So at this time, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to invite counsel for the state to give its opening statement. Then counsel for the defense will give their opening statement. State?
On the morning of January 27th, 2017, the defendant, Timothy Verrill, a paranoid drug dealer trying to protect himself, his business, and his boss, brutally murdered Christine Sullivan and Jenna Pellegrini at 979 Meterborough Road in Farmington. The defendant struck both women in the head multiple times. He stabbed Christine 8 times in the neck and chest. He stabbed Jenna 43 times in the neck, chest, and back. He murdered Christine in the porch area of the house. Christine tried to defend herself, but she was unsuccessful. The defendant murdered Jenna while she was in bed, likely sleeping or unconscious. And after committing these murders, the defendant took disorganized steps to try to hide what he had done. He wrapped the bodies in various tarps and other coverings, and he discarded them like trash underneath the porch. A large pool of Christine's blood had frozen outside on the porch, so the defendant attempted to melt the ice using Prestone driveway heat ice melter. He also covered the icy blood with a small rug. The defendant also concealed a number of bloody items, as well as some of Jenna's personal belongings, in a black plastic and a clear plastic trash bag in the laundry room of the house. 979 Meterborough Road was the home of Dean Smoronk, the on-again but mostly off-again boyfriend of Christine Sullivan. Christine lived there too. Dean and Christine were drug dealers, and the defendant worked for them. In fact, the defendant would sometimes take over business when Dean and Christine went away, such as when they would go down to Florida. In January of 2017, the defendant had started acting strange. He was using a variety of drugs. He grew distant and paranoid, at times not even seeming to be aware of what was going on around him. Friends were so concerned that they tried to get the defendant to see a doctor. About a week before the murders, things seemed to have improved. A friend of the defendant's named Kathy Bradstreet gave the defendant a ride. During that ride, she noticed he seemed to be doing better. The defendant told Kathy that he had been doing too many drugs and that he had been having crazy thoughts, but that he had stopped doing everything. However, Not long after that, if he had even ever truly stopped at all, the defendant began using drugs again. Cocaine, crystal meth, and others. And he once again grew anxious, frantic, and emotional. Let's start by focusing on the end of January 2017. Early in the morning of January 25th, 2 days before the murders, Dean left his home in Farmington to travel to Florida, flying out of the Logan Airport in Boston. Dean had installed a surveillance system inside the house at 979 Meterboro Road. And you'll see video and images of Dean preparing to leave at about 3:50 that morning. Dean is the man circled in blue, and the man circled in orange there is Josh Caldwell, who at the time was a drug associate of Dean, Christine, and the defendants. You'll also see video and images from the Logan Airport, showing Dean going through security at about 5:30 and boarding his plane at about 5:55 that morning. From January 25th until late on January 28th, Dean was in Florida. He stayed at an Allure Suites hotel where he produced a driver's license to identify himself. You're going to learn a little bit about cell phone technology in this trial, including how cell phone records can help establish the location of a particular cell phone, based on the cell towers that phone uses to make and receive calls and text messages. What you'll hear is that Dean's cell phone repeatedly used cell towers in and around Cape Coral, Florida, from January 26th through January 28th, including as he was talking to people back in New Hampshire and trying to reach out to Christine, who had stayed behind. On the evening of January 25th, back in New Hampshire, Christine came home with Jenna. In this image, Christine is the woman circled in purple, and Jenna is circled in green. Jenna was not a regular in this group, and many people associated with Dean and Christine, including the defendant, had never met Jenna before. Christine and Jenna got together that evening with a friend named Steve Clough. Steve was friends with Christine and Jenna and was also a drug associate of Dean and Christine's. The three of them had dinner. Christine had something of an antiques refurbishing side business, and Steve helped her bring a grandfather clock in from her car. On the next day, January 26th, Josh Caldwell and the defendant were out in Farmington. They saw Christine's car parked with a woman inside. Thinking the woman was Christine, Josh got into the car to say hello. He discovered that it wasn't Christine. The woman in the car was Jenna. The defendant stayed in his car. He didn't get out, and he didn't meet Jenna. Then the defendant and Josh went back to Josh's house, where the defendant stayed until the early evening. After leaving Josh's at about 10 p.m., the defendant texted Josh to say that he was heading to Dean's house. Not long after that, at about 11 p.m. on the 26th, the defendant arrived at Dean's home, where Christine and Jenna were present. It wasn't unusual for the defendant to be there. In fact, he had lived at 979 Meterboro Road for some time before that. The defendant stayed at the house for a couple of hours, leaving at about 1 a.m. on January 27th. In this picture, you can see Christine, who's circled in purple, leading the defendant, circled in red, to the door. When the defendant left, he went back to Josh's house. Josh will tell you that when he saw the defendant in the early morning hours of January 27th, 2017, the defendant was acting strange. The defendant seemed paranoid and frantic. Josh had seen the defendant high on crystal meth before, and this was even worse than what Josh had seen in the past. Apparently concerned for the drug organization he was involved in, the defendant asked Josh if Josh thought Jenna might be an informant or someone who provides information to the police. The defendant expressed concern over whether Dean knew Jenna was at the house and what Jenna might be doing there. The defendant asked Josh if Josh thought the defendant should do something about it. In the end, the defendant told Josh he was going to go set up some cameras at Dean's house to see if he could figure out what was going on. And then the defendant left, fueled by his extreme paranoia. At about 2 a.m. on January 27th, the defendant arrived back at 979 Meterborough Road. You will see during the course of this trial that no one else besides the defendant, Christine, and Jenna appear in any of the surveillance videos after 2 a.m. on that day. Not long after arriving, the defendant began taking scattered steps to hide different areas of the house from view. First, the defendant blocked the view of one of the security cameras in the house. Then, during the 4 a.m. hour, the defendant went back and forth between the house and the detached garage. You'll see that the defendant went back and forth between the house and the garage multiple times. Crime scene investigators would later find that all of the ground level windows in that garage had been covered in green spray paint. They would find in the laundry room of the house 2 used cans of green spray paint, each of them with the defendant's fingerprints on them. According to the surveillance videos, in the early morning hours of January 27th, Christine was wearing what appears to be a cowl neck sweater, lighter colored pants, and has on a noticeable pendant necklace. You'll hear that cell phone records of Christine's phone show that she placed a call to Dean at 1:47 a.m. The two of them spoke for about 15 minutes. That was the last outgoing communication from Christine's phone. Jenna was apparently in and out of bed in the morning of the 27th. She took some selfies from bed between 4 and 5 a.m., and the security cameras showed she was doing laundry at about 6:40 in the morning. The videos show that at that time, Jenna was wearing a darker colored hoodie over a lighter hoodie with some writing on it. The selfies show that lighter hoodie had pink strings on it, and it was over a shirt with a small floral print on it. Jenna would soon be murdered in that exact spot. The last video captured by the 979 Meterborough Road surveillance system on January 27th shows only the defendant. At about 6:57 a.m., the defendant quickly walked to the door and locked it. He was wearing a white trucker-style hat, a flannel shirt, and carrying his shoes in his hand. There were no more videos from the 27th. The defendant walked off camera in the direction of the security system controls, and then the system went dead. The evidence will show that at this point, the only 3 people in that house were the defendant, Christine, and Jenna. At some point after locking that door, the defendant struck. The murders were disorganized and hyper. They weren't cold and calculated. They were emotional and they were passionate. The defendant struck Christine multiple times in the head with a blunt instrument. These were extremely forceful blows, which caused bleeding in her brain. One of the blows was so powerful that it caused extensive fracturing around a large part of Christine's skull. You'll hear that Christine was alive for these blows. The defendant also stabbed Christine 8 times in the neck and chest. He cut the carotid artery in her neck, penetrated both of her lungs, and pierced her heart through and through. You'll hear Christine was alive for at least some of those wounds. Christine tried to defend herself. She suffered broken and cut fingers in an attempt to ward off this vicious attack. But she wasn't successful. The chief medical examiner for the state of New Hampshire would later rule Christine's death a homicide, caused by multiple stab wounds with perforations of the lung and heart and blunt impact injuries of the head, causing complex skull fractures and bleeding and swelling of the brain. The attack on Christine likely took place in the outdoor porch area, as her blood would later be found in that location. The defendant murdered Jenna while she was in bed. There was no evidence that she tried to defend herself. She was likely sleeping or unconscious at the time. As with Christine, the defendant also struck Jenna in the head, causing fractures of the skull and brain bleeding, although not quite as extensive as what he had caused Christine. Jenna was alive for these blows. The defendant then stabbed Jenna to death, inflicting 43 stab wounds to her neck, chest, and back. He sliced her carotid artery and her jugular vein and pierced each of her lungs multiple times. Jenna also suffered multiple fractured ribs. You'll hear she was alive for at least some of those wounds. The chief medical examiner would later rule Jenna's death a homicide caused by multiple stab wounds with perforations of the left carotid artery and lungs. After murdering these women, the evidence will show the defendant tried to clean up the scene. His efforts were as disorganized and hyper as the killings themselves. He hid the bodies by wrapping them in bedding, drop cloths, and a frayed tarp. The tarp left blue strings in Jenna's room and throughout the house. He then discarded the bodies under the porch, piling junk on top of them as if they were trash. You'll see and hear that beneath this bench, wrapped in those tarps and other coverings, investigators discovered the bodies of Christine Sullivan and Jenna Pellegrini. After committing the murders, the defendant returned to Josh Caldwell's house sometime around 11 a.m. or noon on January 27th. When the defendant arrived at Josh's, he grabbed a beer out of his car and went inside. Josh will tell you that when the defendant walked past him to enter the house, he said to Josh, "Interesting night." The defendant was behaving strangely and smelled strongly of body odor. He was wearing only a t-shirt, not the flannel shirt that he had on previously. Continuing with his strange behavior, the defendant asked Josh for a change of pants, which Josh provided, and which the defendant then changed into right there on the spot. In addition to the beer he had taken from his car, the defendant began drinking shot after shot of alcohol, about 3 or 4 shots in all. Josh will tell you that the defendant was just staring off into the distance as he was doing this. Concerned that the defendant might have done something more than just set up cameras at Dean's house, Josh told the defendant that Dean would be pissed if the defendant had gone up there and done something stupid. To which the defendant's reply was to ask in a surprised tone, "Really?" Not long after, the defendant left Josh's house. As the defendant left, he told Josh he had to go tie up some loose ends. Sometime after leaving Josh's, you'll see the defendant went to make some purchases. He first went to the Walmart in Rochester where he purchased a prepaid phone card. Then the defendant went to the Lowe's in Rochester. A significant amount of Christine's blood had frozen on the porch next to a hot tub, and he needed to melt the ice. At Lowe's, the defendant purchased 2 bags of solar salt, 2 containers of Prestone driveway heat ice melter, and a 2-quart bottle of ammonia cleaner. Investigators would later find a blood stain next to the hot tub underneath a purple rug. DNA testing would confirm the blood on that rug was Christine's. The blood stain was covered in what appeared to be ice melter. And just inside the door, investigators found a nearly empty container of Prestone driveway heat. That container had only the defendant's fingerprints on it, no one else's, including one of his fingerprints on the cap. A second container of Prestone driveway heat would later be found in the defendant's car, along with an open and partially used bottle of ammonia cleaner. While cleaning up the scene, the defendant also concealed a number of items in a couple of trash bags which he left in the laundry room of the house. In that laundry room, investigators would find a clear plastic trash bag containing a number of blood-stained items. DNA testing would confirm the blood on those items was Christine's. That clear plastic trash bag had the defendant's fingerprints on it. No one else's prints were on that bag. In the black plastic trash bag, also found in the laundry room, investigators would discover multiple blood-stained items, including a sheet that was soaked with what DNA testing would later confirm was Jenna's blood. Many of Jenna's personal belongings were also in this trash bag. This bag had the defendant's fingerprints on it. No one else's prints were on that bag. In a back bedroom on the main floor of the house, investigators found an unmade bed with a large blood stain on the bare mattress. There was a small rug lying next to the mattress. DNA testing would confirm that blood was Jenna's. Investigators would ultimately find the wrapped bodies of the 2 women in the junk heap outside where the defendant had left them. You'll see that when their bodies were found, both women were wearing the clothes they can be seen wearing in those videos from early in the morning of January 27th. Christine in a cowl neck sweater, light-colored pants, and the pendant necklace, and Jenna in a darker hoodie over a lighter hoodie, which was over a floral printed tank top. Next to the junk heap, where the defendant hid the women's bodies, there was a bucket with some bloody paper towels and a pail with a white trucker-style hat stained with blood. The evidence will show that this was the hat the defendant was wearing in that final surveillance video from January 27th. DNA testing confirmed that both Christine and the defendant's DNA were on that hat. While the defendant was cleaning up from the murders, Dean was attempting to get in touch with Christine. Between about 10:50 in the morning and 12:12 in the afternoon on the 27th, Dean called and texted Christine's cell phone, but she didn't answer his calls. She didn't respond to his text messages. All of these calls and texts used cell towers in and around Cape Coral, Florida. Another individual named Jason Parker was at the same time trying to get in touch with Christine. She didn't respond to his calls. She didn't answer his text messages. Kathy Bradstreet also tried to get in touch with Christine, to no avail. Later that afternoon, still on the 27th, Josh drove past Dean's house to see if anything was going on. When he did, he saw the defendant's car parked up close to the house, where Christine would usually park. Josh decided that he had to let Dean know something was up, so he reached out to Dean. "How bad is the news?" asked Dean. 10, said Josh. "Oi," replied Dean. Josh told Dean he needed to come back from Florida. Josh knew that if something bad had happened in that house, the police needed to get involved. But Josh didn't want to be the one to call the police, knowing that Dean might have drugs in the house. In response, Dean reached out to the defendant to check the house. But the defendant claimed the house was locked up tight. He also told Dean Christine's car was there, and that it was locked too. The next day, on January 28th, Dean asked some other people to check the house for Christine. He still had not heard from her. The first was Jason Parker, who went to the house around noon. Nobody answered the doors when Jason arrived. He went in the garage, and he saw the painted windows. He cleared the ice off the porch by the driveway, and he went up to the enclosed three-season porch on the main floor. He didn't go into the house itself. Later that same afternoon, the 28th, Kathy Bradstreet was trying to reach the defendant. She was concerned about her friend Christine because they had plans for that weekend, and Christine wasn't answering her. But Kathy wasn't immediately able to get a hold of the defendant because the defendant had gotten a new phone. You'll see records and video from the Sprint store in Dover showing that on January 28th, the defendant and his girlfriend purchased a new phone. Kathy eventually learned of the defendant's new number, and she was able to reach him. When she spoke to him, the defendant told Kathy that he had gotten a new phone because he was tired of his old life. He needed a break, and he threw his old phone away. The defendant told Kathy he had been to Dean's house twice. Once he wasn't able to get in, and one time he got in, got freaked out, and he left. But you'll see that the defendant didn't seem as concerned about Christine as others did. On the afternoon of the 28th, when Dean, Kathy, and others were trying to figure out where Christine was, the defendant was shopping, buying new boots, shoes, and other clothes, first at Red's Shoe Barn and then at Target. Later that afternoon, still looking for Christine, Dean called Steve Clough and asked him to go check the house. Steve went to the house with two other people, Buddy Seymour and Nicole Stedman. Nicole stayed in the car, but Buddy and Steve went to check things out. Steve saw that Christine's car was there, parked behind the house. They checked the garage, and Steve saw the painted windows. They checked around the outside of the house, but at first were unable to get inside. At some point, Steve called Dean, and Dean authorized him to break into the house and check inside. Steve and Buddy went up to that three-season porch, and Buddy used a shovel to pry open the sliding glass door that led from the porch into the kitchen. Investigators would later find one of Buddy's fingerprints on the handle of that shovel. The digging part of that shovel was stained with Christine's blood. After entering the house, Steve and Buddy eventually made their way to the bedroom where Jenna had been staying. They saw that the mattress was bare except for a rug. When they lifted the rug, they saw a large blood stain underneath it. They then left the house, but not before taking some drugs and drug paraphernalia that had been laying out. Based on what he was hearing from back in New Hampshire, Dean had bought a plane ticket home from Florida. At about 8:40, Dean boarded the plane in Florida, headed for the Logan Airport in Boston. While Dean was on his way back from Florida, the defendant was out with some friends. He then called his mother, Suzanne, to come pick him up and asked her to take him to rehab. Suzanne will tell you that the defendant seemed hyper and emotional, and that she was frightened for him. She took him to the Wentworth Douglas Hospital emergency room to try to get him some help. While there, she heard the defendant tell hospital staff that he had been using cocaine, meth, and some other drugs. Dean arrived back at the Logan Airport at about 11:38 p.m. on the 28th. He was picked up by Josh Caldwell, who brought Dean back to 979 Meterborough Road. They arrived at about 1 or 1:30 in the morning on the 29th. Josh helped Dean clear the house to make sure no one was inside. Dean and Josh saw the blood stain on the mattress, and then Josh left the house, taking some drugs with him when he left. A little while after that, Steve Clough arrived at the house in case Dean needed anything. Dean turned on the surveillance system, which captured him examining things in his laundry room that were different than when he had left. This clip shows a date and time of January 27th at 9:35 a.m. But what the forensic expert who analyzed the surveillance recorder will tell you is that when he turned on the device to analyze it, its internal clock was off. It was off by 1 day, 17 hours, and 18 minutes. If you add 1 day, 17 hours, and 18 minutes to 9:35 on January 27th, you get approximately 2:53 a.m. on January 29th, which you'll see is consistent with when Dean arrived home and was checking his house. In the clip, Dean is dressed in the same clothes he was wearing when he arrived back at the Logan Airport from Florida and when the police arrived later that night. That bottom image is taken from police body cam footage when they responded to Dean's 911 call. The man circled in orange is Steve Clough, who was still there with Dean when the police arrived. The forensic expert is not going to be able to tell you when the DVR's internal clock went wrong, but you'll see that other recovered videos have date and timestamps consistent with corroborating evidence, such as the defendant telling Josh he was going to Dean's house and the defendant being seen arriving a short time later. Dean called the police at about 3 a.m. on January 29th, 2017. After Dean called 911, the police arrived and began their investigation. They found the wrapped bodies of the women and the other items mentioned earlier. They also found out on the kitchen counter a number of cleaning products, including bleach, all-purpose cleaners, carpet cleaners, and air sanitizers. Police found traces of blue frayed tarp in Jenna's room and throughout the house. And as the police began to investigate, they identified the defendant as someone they wanted to talk to. On January 29th, a state police trooper called the defendant. At the time, the defendant was at his brother Jeff's house in Newton, New Hampshire. The defendant and his girlfriend had taken his girlfriend's car to Jeff's house. The defendant told the trooper he was willing to speak with investigators and gave the trooper his brother's address. But after he got off the phone, he told his brother he was going outside to wait for the police. And then he left in his girlfriend's car, leaving his girlfriend behind. But before driving away, the defendant removed his girlfriend's New Hampshire license plates and replaced them with his brother's roommate's Massachusetts plates. You're going to hear that in the following days, the defendant continued to act like someone who had just committed a life-altering act. Over the course of the state's presentation, you're going to hear from witnesses who used and sold drugs. Their attitudes towards the police are probably a lot different than yours are. It's not necessarily their first instinct to call the police when something suspicious has happened. They likely lied to the police when asked about their own drug use and drug sales. What we want to ask you to consider as you listen to those witnesses is that while witnesses may lie about their own drug use and their own drug sales in an interest of self-preservation, that same interest does not give them a reason to lie about what they knew about the murders of Christine and Jenna. In fact, the majority of the civilian witnesses the state will present to you were friends with Christine, Jenna, and/or the defendant. So we invite you, as we discussed with each of you in jury selection, to keep an open mind when you're listening to these witnesses. Look for how the scientific, video, photograph, cell phone, and other evidence corroborates the testimony of these witnesses. Pay attention to when a witness might have had that self-preservation motive to lie, versus when they were trying to make sure the police had the best information to use in their investigation into the murders of Christine and Jenna. Now, I imagine when I'm done speaking with you in a few minutes, defense is going to come up here and they're going to tell you that somebody else murdered Christine and Jenna. They may talk to you about untested evidence and may ask you to speculate. They're going to create a boogeyman, and they might even give that boogeyman a name. We don't know who that's going to be yet. And it's true that Dean and Christine had a terrible relationship. Dean was abusive, and he didn't hide the way he felt about Christine, often saying and texting horrible things about Christine to others. It was no secret among anyone acquainted with the two how Dean treated Christine. But on January 27th, 2017, Dean was in Florida. On January 28th, when Dean thought something was wrong in New Hampshire, he came back. And when Dean came back, he called the police. We're not going to make any excuses for Dean or the way that he treated Christine. But the evidence will show that when he thought something had happened to Christine, he didn't run. He wanted law enforcement to investigate. They did investigate. And by the end of this trial, you are going to see that the evidence they gathered conclusively shows the following things. When the defendant locked the door to 979 Meadowborough Road at 6:57 a.m. on January 27th, the only three people in that house were the defendant, Christine, and Jenna. Christine and Jenna were killed in the clothes they were wearing during those videos in the early morning hours of January 27th. Christine was savagely beaten in the head and stabbed 8 times. Jenna was beaten in the head and stabbed 43 times. And after he murdered them, the defendant concealed their bodies by wrapping them up and piling junk on top of them like trash. Hours after the murders, the defendant purchased 2 containers of Prestone driveway heat ice melt, which was later found poured over Christine's frozen bloodstain, a near-empty container with the defendant's fingerprints on it, no one else's, found nearby. The second container found in his car. Objects stained with Christine's blood were concealed in a clear plastic trash bag with the defendant's fingerprints on it, no one else's. Jenna's personal belongings and a sheet stained with her blood were concealed in a black plastic trash bag with the defendant's fingerprints on it, no one else's. And then, when the police wanted to talk to the defendant, he swapped out the license plates on his girlfriend's car and he fled. There is no boogeyman. The evidence in this case will show that the defendant is the only one who cleaned up the scene, the only one who fled from the police, and the only one who killed. And at the end of this trial, will ask you to return a verdict consistent with that evidence. Guilty. Thank you.
Thank you.
On Friday, January 27th, Christine and Jenna fought back against their killers. They fought so hard that their killer's DNA got embedded under their fingernails. That killer's DNA was not Tim's. DNA testing definitively excluded him. In the struggle, Christine broke her ring finger and the ring she was wearing. The killer's DNA was on that ring. Again, DNA evidence excluded Tim. Christine fought back so hard that she injured her killer, sending his blood onto the ceiling. Again, that DNA was not Tim's. Tim did not kill Christine and Jenna. Tim was not told to kill Christine or Jenna. And Tim did not have any motive, any incentive, or any reason to kill Christine or Jenna. Despite evidence that points away from Tim, despite the lack of physical evidence and the absence of any motive, the state will ask you to convict a man for murders he did not commit. Tim is not guilty. This will be a long case. And at the end, you're going to have a lot of questions. Questions that aren't trivial. Questions that are serious and fundamental, that any person would want answered, especially in a case of this magnitude. Questions about the quality of the evidence. These questions are what reasonable doubt is. And the state won't have the answers to these questions. Among others, they won't and can't answer when were the women killed, how were they killed, how many people were involved, and crucially, why were they killed? Who had the motive to kill them? The state may say at the end that they don't have to answer these questions. But don't let the state dismiss questions that they can't answer as questions that don't matter. The state must answer every question that gives you reasonable doubt. And when they don't, you must acquit Tim. The state's inability to answer these questions starts with the investigation. The police carried out a distracted and incomplete investigation. Their errors were so egregious that we had to stop the first trial more than 2 weeks into evidence. The state may tell you that that's all in the past. And in one important respect, that's true. What's done is done. There's no going back in time to conduct a thorough and focused and proper investigation. There's no transforming an unreliable investigation into a reliable investigation. Now, we're not saying that this was a dishonest investigation, but rather that it was fatally flawed. And it was flawed in a variety of ways. Throughout this case and throughout the evidence, you'll see patterns. The state didn't collect evidence that they should have. The state didn't test scientific evidence they should have. The state ignored leads they shouldn't have. The state trusted self-interested people and dubious sources that they shouldn't have. And based on that, they made choices and decisions about this case that they shouldn't have. The damage of those decisions resonates to this moment. The foundation of the state's case is weak, and most importantly, its orientation toward Tim is misplaced and wrong. It will not withstand your scrutiny. So, what's the broader framework of this case? Well, it starts with drugs. The state told you, each of you last week, that this case involves drug users and drug sellers. In fact, this case sits within a dynamic universe of people buying drugs to use them, people buying drugs to sell them, people selling drugs to buy more drugs, and most importantly, people striving to grow their drug-selling enterprise. Now, Tim himself had bought drugs, he used drugs, and he sold drugs for Dean. But he had no desire for bigger and better things in the drug world. In fact, one source of tension between Tim and other players in this case was his growing detachment from this world. He was seen as lazy and becoming unreliable. And that was a problem for the committed guys. Buyers were getting angry. Revenue streams were becoming threatened. And word about this was getting back to Dean, the boss, who texted Josh, the guy Dean saw as Tim's replacement, that Tim was, quote, being stupid, and that Dean wouldn't let it slide. So how did things get to that point? Well, it starts with Dean and Christine. They'd met a few years back in Florida, and Christine came to New Hampshire to help Dean with his drug operations here. In 2017, Dean also had a home in Cape Coral, Florida, where he spent most of his time running another corner of his drug business. Meanwhile, Christine was up here running the drug business in New Hampshire. She also had a legitimate side business of her own, selling secondhand items she refurbished. Tim had become friends with Dean and Christine, meeting Dean through going to music festivals. Tim would end up selling drugs for them to local people in the area. He would also look after the house when both of them were gone, and he often did errands or chores for Christine. At the time of the murders, he lived in Dover with his girlfriend, and his parents and brother lived nearby. Now, Dean and Christine were romantic partners as much as they were business partners. But by 2016 and 2017, both of those relationships completely deteriorated. Dean saw Christine as a disloyal, lying, his words. Christine was getting in the way and jeopardizing Dean's drug enterprise. He couldn't wait until she was out of the picture, one way or another. 2016 is also the time that Josh Caldwell enters the picture. Now, Tim and Josh were from the same area and knew each other in the early 2000s through a mutual friend. They fell out of touch but reconnected in 2016. And at that time, people owed Dean drug money. People were in debt to him. And Dean wanted his money. He needed somebody to collect his debt for him. And that was a job that everyone knew that Tim did not, could not, and would not do. You'll hear that Tim is gentle and deferential, is not an aggressive guy. Tim introduced Dean and Josh in the fall of 2016. Josh seemed to fit the profile of what Dean was looking for, a go-getter. Now, you're going to hear from Josh. He's going to present to you today as a reformed man. But back in 2017, he was a leader of a motorcycle gang. Josh used drugs, he sold drugs, and people in that circle did the same. Josh didn't have a legitimate job. Not only was he in a motorcycle gang, but he was a high-ranking member. They were called the Mountain Men, and they're well known to law enforcement. Josh was the sergeant of arms for the club. He was responsible for keeping members in line, both inside and outside the clubhouse. Josh had power over who could be initiated into the group and who should be expelled. He was also a liaison to similar crews across state lines. He took his powerful role seriously. And there were strict rules amongst these brothers. That's how they called each other, including oaths to not speak to the police and codes of silence. Mutual fear amongst these brothers kept members in line. This was not Bible study. Ultimately, you'll see how quickly Josh abandoned this code to deflect suspicion and misdirect police in this case. But with the Mountain Men, he was deeply invested in making a career, his words, with them. On the other hand, Tim had no involvement with a gang or a club. He was not a member of the Mountain Men. He didn't even own a motorcycle. Tim is an artist. He liked to drink beer and liquor and play video games and listen to music. He was kind of a loafer, kind of unambitious. And like I said earlier, that's how Josh came into the picture. Josh will admit to you that Dean originally hired him to be his muscle, to collect Dean's drug debt. But their relationship quickly evolved. Josh will say he never actually collected drug debt for Dean. We may never know if that's a truth or a lie. But we do know, and what the evidence will show, is that Dean and Josh quickly saw opportunities in each other. Josh will lie about the premise of his arrangement with Dean. He'll say it had nothing to do with the mountain men. But you'll see evidence for why that's not believable. In November of 2016, shortly after Josh had met Dean, Dean brought Josh down to Florida so Josh could help Dean collect debt. The next month, Dean invited Josh down to Florida again, but this time for a vacation. And Josh's girlfriend, Cassie, was invited too. Josh was moving up. To Dean, Josh represented untapped streams of drug revenue. Josh's connections both inside and outside of the club meant more numbers. More people to work for Dean, more people to buy drugs from Dean, more people to collect his debt. And as an added benefit, those men came with a code of silence. Now, fast forward to the week of the murders, and Josh was devising a whole system to track this budding enterprise with Dean. To cover their digital tracks, Josh named their business the Hill Ranch Installations. This is not dissimilar to one of his other drug dealing enterprises, in which drug deals were referred to as snowplow contracts. You'll hear about that also. On January 25th, 2 days before the murders, Dean and Josh exchanged giddy texts about their dreams. Dean says, I'm committing each and every resource to this, and it's going to be one hell of a trick, brother. Josh responds, it's going to be a hell of a year, bro. These two cannot wait to get their new and exciting partnership started and be done with their old ties for good. Now, what made Dean and Josh so enthusiastic that week about becoming partners? Well, the previous weekend, the weekend before the murders, Josh invited Dean to come to a party thrown by the Mountain Men at the Mountain Men's clubhouse. He introduces Dean to his crew, to his brothers. This meant a lot to Josh. He was proving himself to Dean and to his crew. After Dean left the party, Josh texted Dean thanking him for coming and for hanging out with me and my brothers. Josh texted Dean that it meant a lot to him that he came down despite Dean's busy schedule. Dean tells Josh, I was glad to be there, bro. He praises the Mountain Men as quite the clan of good dudes. Josh tells Dean that he truly considers him a brother, and he's proud to call him that. Soon, Josh is signing off his texts with Dean with love and respect, the same tagline he used with his brothers in the Mountain Men. So a few days later, when Dean texts Josh that he's committed every and each resource to this, and that it's going to be a hell of a year, it's because that day Josh told him 20 minutes prior that people are, quote, chomping at the bit to buy his drugs. This is good news for Dean. He asks Josh, I take it there was a very good impression made. Josh responds, very, my brother, very. Remember, this is just days after Josh introduced Dean to the Mountain Men. The same week, the week before the murders, Dean and Josh would discuss the Tim problem. Tim was distancing himself, becoming hard to reach. He was missing delivery appointments. You'll hear from others how Tim was getting sick of this world, but leaving it isn't easy. Instead of saying he wanted out, he would tell them that he just wasn't feeling well or was confused, or that he wasn't feeling like himself. Now, Josh knew that Tim was slacking, and Josh knew that Dean was getting fed up with it. Oh, and Josh knew that Dean hated Christine. Dean would tell things to Josh like, I'm so sick of that. I have to get her out of my life as soon as possible. Josh was ready to seize the opportunity in front of him, and Dean welcomed it. Tim was becoming disposable. On January 25th, 2 days before the murders, Dean was about to head to Florida. But not before Dean and Josh texted each other about the importance of seeing each other. 3 a.m, Josh went to Meterboro, Dean's house. You'll see video from the home surveillance system showing Josh and Dean at that time. You'll see Dean showing Josh and pointing out the surveillance system. Before that, Josh had no need to know about the surveillance system. But for some reason, that early morning, Dean wanted to make sure Josh knew how it operated. Then they walked out of the house, Josh went home, and Christine drove Dean to the airport. When Dean flew back 5 days later, Christine was dead, and Josh picked him up at the airport. You may be tempted to fixate on those 2 or 3 days, but doing so would be at the expense of critical context and essential information. That could help explain what happened. Another reason that you must consider the context is because what we know about that weekend is limited by the incomplete investigation that followed. An investigation that was sloppy, distracted, and mismanaged. A pattern you'll see throughout the evidence is that the police listened to the wrong people, they looked in the wrong directions, and they missed leads that could never be recovered. Now, when it comes to the investigation, it's important to know that federal agents were investigating Dean's multi-state drug operation prior to the murders. And within days of the murders, before the crime scene was even cleared, the New Hampshire police learned about that investigation. Within a few weeks, a decision was made to leave to the feds the drug investigation and New Hampshire to be in charge of the murder investigation. However, the federal agency would still use state manpower to pursue their own drug investigation, even though those officers remained assigned to the murder investigation. These investigators continued pursuing the drug investigation both here in New Hampshire and throughout the country. They went to Florida and California with the DEA. They repeatedly interviewed individuals in New Hampshire about the drug operation. They wiretapped witnesses to record conversations. And they dug up Dean's backyard with a backhoe 6 months after the murders. Remember, when it comes to the murders, you'll see they zeroed in on Tim almost immediately, and they got tunnel vision. They treated incomplete evidence as complete. And again, you'll recognize a pattern that they were steered toward Tim by individuals who had every incentive to lie, every incentive to divert attention away from them, and every incentive to get in good with the police. Over time, you'll see that leads were missed, suspects were ignored, and physical evidence was ignored. Ultimately, the disjointed investigation caused a mistrial in 2019. That's because the state's lead investigator failed to turn over a significant amount of evidence until the middle of trial. Mistrial means that there was so much non-disclosed evidence that the trial literally had to end so it could be sorted through. The bottom line is that a lack of professionalism raises a lack of confidence in the decisions and results of this investigation. Now, we're not saying that the police or the state were intentionally hiding anything. But if the investigation had been done properly, they'd be telling a different story. Now, you'll hear the state talk with confidence about their case. And we know their case didn't materialize out of thin air. But you need to think critically about what you see and what you don't see. You already saw a video of Tim obscuring a camera, but he wasn't the only person to do that. Why would people using drugs want to obscure a camera? You'll hear scientific evidence, like DNA and fingerprint evidence. You'll hear how Tim's fingerprints were found on a few items at the house that were associated with the murders. We won't dispute that those fingerprints are his, but no one can say how, or more importantly, when Tim handled those items. In fact, you'll see evidence that indicates that he touched those items and used those bags long before the murders. You'll hear that his fingerprints weren't pressed in blood. Don't take what the state says at face value. Think critically and hold them to their burden. You'll also hear about the many items associated with the murder that either didn't have Tim's fingerprints, had other people's fingerprints, were never collected by investigators in the first place, or had prints on them that could have been compared to other suspects, but weren't. What about DNA evidence? You heard about a sweat-stained hat associated with Tim that tested positive for his DNA. But you'll hear that Tim, and see that Tim had a lot of these identical hats. So its presence at the house isn't all that insightful. More importantly, you'll hear about the other male DNA evidence tied much more closely to the murders. I mentioned earlier male blood on the ceiling, That was found in the kitchen, directly above where Christine's blood was found, directly above where she fought back against the man who murdered her. That blood is not Tim's. And the state never bothered to test it against any of the other male DNA they collected in this investigation or that they could have. Same with the male DNA found under both Jenna and Christine's fingernails and the DNA found on Christine's ring. Not Tim's and not tested against others. That's an example of what I say, that leads weren't followed or scientific evidence wasn't examined. You also heard about cell phone towers. That cell phone towers can indicate a person's location. You'll hear that these records indicate that Tim was in or around Farmington on Friday. But you'll also hear that this type of data is approximate and imprecise. It wasn't created by phone companies to track locations. It just reflects which tower provided the strongest signal to a user at any given time. And where the strongest signal comes from doesn't necessarily mean that it came from the closest tower. This data will tell you where the signal was coming from, but it cannot pinpoint where it was going to. You also will hear about some of Tim's behavior, like he got a new phone that weekend. Again, this doesn't tell you that much. First, his girlfriend bought him that phone. You'll hear that before this, and you heard that before this, Tim had to buy prepaid phone cards. His girlfriend bought him this phone and put him on her plan. Second, he put his new phone number on Facebook, not a move of somebody trying to hide. And you might be astonished at how many people in this case had multiple phones and multiple phone numbers. The state's case will be at its strongest if you narrow your vision to the evidence that supports their case, and if you discourage yourself from pushing against those false boundaries. But don't let the state dismiss the questions you will have as insignificant or as speculation. Critically thinking and upholding your oath and duty is not speculating. Your questions will reflect reasonable doubt and expose how inadequate the investigation was and how incomplete this case is. I think this is a good time to talk about Jenna. We don't know much about Jenna, and the state's not going to tell you much about her either. The investigation barely looked into her. The state knew about some of the men she was close with. They knew that she was on the verge of homelessness when Christine led her into her home once Dean left for Florida. But what was going on with her? Why was she in that position? Did anyone have a motive to kill her? You heard how brutal her murder was. Over 40 stab wounds, like it was a crime of passion. We have few answers about Jenna or her killer because the state barely investigated how she spent her final days. But the state will use Jenna as a tool to try to create a narrative against Tim. You may be encouraged to believe that Tim was supposedly concerned about Jenna. She was an informant. But this suggestion doesn't withstand scrutiny. First, Jenna was Christine's guest, and Tim was deferential to Christine. He trusted Christine. Second, let's go to early Friday morning. The state referenced that Tim was at Josh's house. After Tim hung out with Josh, he returned to Meterboro, returned to the home, where he hung out with Christine and Jenna for hours. The women were alive and happy when he was there, and they still were when he left. This part is well documented. On video, you've seen some of it. You'll see Christine and Jenna doing chores, doing laundry, walking around. You'll see Christine on the enclosed porch, where she was likely refurbishing items to sell, and Tim was doing what he frequently did, helping her with her projects. Meanwhile, they were listening to music on an Alexa speaker. You'll hear their voices, their demeanor, as they shouted out names of songs and sang aloud. If Tim was ever skeptical of Jenna, the evidence shows that any skepticism was gone by the early hours of Friday. At the same time, you'll hear evidence and suggestions that Tim killed these women because he was out of his mind. Again, the documented evidence of Tim on those videos and in that audio presents an average man doing normal things, not a crazed maniac. One more point about this. Although you hear about Tim's demeanor from Josh and Dean, you'll hear from other witnesses who knew about Tim, like Kathy Bradstreet, that she saw him shortly before the murders, and he looked much better and healthier than he did the month prior. And you'll hear that Tim's general feeling of being ill or in discomfort coincided with his efforts to reduce his drug use. Why will you hear suggestions about Tim losing his mind and becoming homicidal? Because you won't hear any credible or convincing explanation for why Tim would commit heinous murders. He had no motive to kill them. Suggestions that Tim became a homicidal maniac because he may have been feeling dazed or unwell is speculation. It's wild speculation. It's the type of speculation that the state has warned you not to take. I'll leave you with a few quick points to think about. Consider the other players you will learn about in this case, their suspicious behavior that they can't account for, their trips to the house, their cryptic communications, their associations with Dean. One moment that will stick out to you is from the Friday afternoon the women were killed. Josh sends Dean an urgent message. There's a problem. On a scale of 1 to 10, this emergency is a 10. You saw those texts on the screen. Josh wants to talk immediately, but not over the phone and not over text. The conversation, he says, must be over an untraceable, encrypted app. What do you think that conversation was about? Josh will say he was just expressing concern about Christine. But guess who Josh never texts or calls to check in on? Christine. Why would you urgently need to communicate over an untraceable app just to express a vague feeling of concern about someone? Then on 4 a.m. on Saturday morning, Josh runs to the house alone to snatch a camera outside he believed may have captured the killer. Why? Josh thought that this camera was independent from the rest of the surveillance system, which had 8 or 10 cameras throughout the property. He thought this camera could record even if the rest of the system was shut down. You'll hear that he was wrong, but it won't answer the obvious question of why he did that. You also heard a little bit about the other people that went to the house that weekend at the behest of Dean. What were all these people not doing, including Josh and Dean when Dean finally arrived? They weren't calling the police, not for days. Finally, when Dean eventually gets to the house early Saturday morning, after spending 90 minutes in the car with Josh from the airport, he waited 2 hours before calling the police. Instead, he and Josh walked around the house. Dean took pictures of a bloody mattress and texted it to friends. Dean turned the surveillance system back on. It took 2 hours for Dean to call 911. At the end of the case, the state may argue that they don't need to prove exactly what happened, as long as they prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They may say that questions you have aren't relevant to the deliberations, that they aren't relevant to the elements, that they answered everything you needed to hear. Remember, these are arguments. Hold the state to its burden. Don't let them shed it. Don't walk away thinking that your significant and fundamental questions aren't important, because they are. And they arise from the many sources of reasonable doubt throughout this case. One thing is indisputable. The state needs to prove to you exactly who killed these women. They're speculating it was Tim. They're pointing at the wrong man. The evidence doesn't support convicting Tim. Tim did not kill those women, and Tim is not guilty.
That's all for this week. If you want to see more of the Small Town Secrets murder trial, there's a link in the show notes to Court TV's continuing coverage of this case. And you can see me every weeknight at 8 p.m. Eastern on my show, Closing Arguments with Vinnie Politan, where we dive deeper into the latest and breaking true crime stories. Thank you so much for downloading, and as always, please don't forget to hug the kids.
This podcast is a production of Court TV. Go to courttv.com for more content, trials on demand, and to find out how to watch Court TV in your area.